The heifer calf cost $4 from the back of a stock trailer at the Barclay County Fairgrounds on a Saturday morning in September of 1933. And the reason she cost $4 was that she was the wrong color for anyone standing at that trailer to want her. Marigold Ashcroft had come to the fairground sale for barbed wire and a used cream separator, both of which she found before 10 o'clock at prices she could live with. She was walking the wire back to the truck when she passed the last trailer in the row, a rancher from over toward Pawnee County, unloading 3 culled dairy heifers he wanted gone before the drive home got any longer. Two of the heifers were unremarkable black and white crosses, thin but sound. The third stopped her. She was a deep, warm fawn color, gold brown across the body, with a paler cream running down the legs and belly, and a face marked white in a way that made her look, for a moment, like she belonged to some different and better decade than the one Kansas was currently living through. The rancher said she was a Guernsey, or mostly one, out of a bull he couldn't account for and a cow he'd bought at a closeout sale 2 years back. He said Guernseys didn't have the frame for real production, and he'd rather have a proper Holstein any day. And if Marigold wanted the gold calf, she could have her for $4, because he wasn't hauling her another 80 miles for what she was worth. Marigold looked at the heifer's eyes, which were large and dark and steady in a way that unsettled her slightly, the specific calm of an animal that has already decided something about its own worth, regardless of what the man holding the lead rope believes. She paid the $4, a $4 Guernsey heifer. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This channel reaches people from all across the country, and we love knowing where our stories land. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. We have new stories every week. Her name was Marigold Ashcroft. She was 27 years old and had been running her mother's 32 acres alone in Barclay County, Kansas, since her mother's heart gave out in the spring of 1931. 3 years after her father had already been 3 years gone to a threshing accident that the county still talked about when it wanted an example of how fast a farm could go from a family operation to a woman standing in a kitchen deciding what came next. The Ashcroft place had never been a cattle operation in any serious sense. Her father had kept 2 cows for the house and sold the cream to the co-op the way every small farm in the county did, 14 cents a pound for butterfat when the price was fair and less when it wasn't. Marigold had kept that arrangement going out of habit more than ambition. 2 aging shorthorn cows producing milk that tested at 3.5% butterfat on a good week, which was what most cream stations in Kansas were built around, and paid accordingly. She had not gone to the fairgrounds looking for a cow, but she had been reading in the particular way a person reads when the reading is less about information and more about keeping a door open in her mind that the rest of her life had mostly closed. Her father's old Farmer's Bulletin subscription had lapsed with his death, but the county extension office kept back issues, and she had spent 3 winter evenings in 1932 going through a stack of them looking for anything that might tell her how to make 32 acres do more than survive. One bulletin, water-stained and missing its back cover, described the Channel Island dairy breeds, Jersey and Guernsey both, and the specific quality that separated them from the standard Holstein herds that dominated American dairying. Guernsey milk ran higher in butterfat than almost any other breed commonly kept in the Midwest, 5% or better against the Holstein's 3.5%, and higher still in a compound called carotene that gave Guernsey cream and butter a deep natural gold color that needed no dye and that specialty buyers, the bulletin said, paid a premium for precisely because it could not be faked by ordinary means. The bulletin quoted a cream station in Wisconsin paying Guernsey producers 18 cents a pound against the standard 14, and noted that demand outstripped the available supply because the breed remained rare outside a handful of established herds in the eastern states. It went on in the dry, factual voice of an agricultural pamphlet to note that the breed originated on the Isle of Guernsey in the English Channel, developed in relative isolation over several centuries specifically for the richness of its milk rather than its volume, which was why Guernseys never produced the sheer gallons a Holstein could manage, but produced, pound for pound, a butterfat content that made every gallon worth more than the raw quantity suggested. Marigold had read that page twice and then set the bulletin aside because she owned 2 shorthorn cows and no capital for anything else. She had not expected the $4 culled heifer at the fairgrounds 14 months later to be the thing that made the bulletin relevant. She named the heifer Clover, for reasons she did not examine closely beyond the fact that the name suited the color of her, and she brought her home in the trailer bed alongside the wire and the cream separator, and she put her in the small pen beside the barn where the shorthorns could see her but not crowd her while she settled. Clover was a yearling, not yet bred, which meant Marigold had a year to learn what she was actually working with before there would be milk to test at all. She spent that year doing the two things she had learned, growing up on this farm, that mattered most when you had taken on something you did not yet understand. She fed correctly, and she watched carefully. She wrote to the extension office in the county seat and asked what she could find out about registered Guernsey breeders anywhere in the state, and the answer that came back 6 weeks later named a single documented herd, a family operation near Manhattan, Kansas, that had been founded from imported New York stock in the previous decade, and that maintained the breed registry records the American Guernsey Cattle Club required for any animal to carry official standing. The letter noted, almost as an aside, that registered Guernsey herds remained scarce west of the Mississippi entirely. Most of the breed's American population still concentrated in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, where it had first been imported in the previous century, which meant that whatever Marigold had standing in her pen was rarer in Kansas than the extension agent's dry prose let on. Marigold wrote to that family and asked, cautiously, whether a grade Guernsey heifer of unknown but likely full breeding could be evaluated, and whether artificial insemination or a bull lease might be available to a small operation 2 counties over. The reply took a month. It was encouraging in the specific, careful way of people who had spent a long time building something rare and did not want to promise more than the facts supported. They could not register Clover without a documented pedigree, but they could evaluate her conformation, and if she proved out as she looked, they had a young registered bull they leased locally for a modest stud fee that would at minimum put a half-blood calf on the ground with real Guernsey characteristics, and at best, if Clover's own breeding held true, a calf that could eventually enter the registry herself. The bull lease cost $6, which was more than Marigold had wanted to spend on an unproven animal, but she had already spent $4 on the animal itself and reasoned that the additional cost was the actual investment. The $4 had merely been the door. She bred Clover in November of 1933, working from the gestation figures the extension office confirmed for her, roughly 283 days for cattle, which put a calving date in the 3rd week of August 1934, assuming the breeding held on the first service, which was not guaranteed and which she did not assume until a veterinary check in February confirmed it. Through that winter, she fed Clover the way the Manhattan family's letter had recommended, a ration heavier in good grass hay than her shorthorns had ever needed, supplemented through the coldest months with a small daily measure of ground grain to carry the additional demands of pregnancy without letting her drop condition, the way a heifer sometimes did on hay alone through a hard Kansas January. She kept a shed open to Clover at all times so the animal could get out of the wind when she chose, since the extension pamphlet had noted that dairy breeds, Guernseys especially, produced better across a lactation when they were not made to stand exposed through cold snaps the way range cattle were sometimes expected to. She checked Clover's condition weekly, running a hand along the ribs and the hip bones the way her father had taught her before she was old enough to understand why it mattered, watching for the specific thinning that meant the ration needed adjusting before it became a problem rather than after. It was not glamorous work. It was the same unglamorous attentiveness that kept any animal alive through a Kansas winter, and Marigold had never believed there was a shortcut around it, whatever the color of the cow. Daniel Whitfield first came to the fence in October, before Clover was even bred, on the pretext of the shared property line where his family's land bordered the Ashcraft acreage along a stretch of scrub timber that had needed clearing for as long as either family had owned the ground. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent his life behind a plow and a fence stretcher, with reddish-brown hair that the sun had lightened at the crown, and a face weathered enough that people who did not know him guessed him older than he was. His eyes were a deep hazel green, sharp and unhurried, the kind of eyes that gave the impression of a man cataloging everything in view and revealing his conclusions only when he judged it useful to. He said the timberline needed cutting back before it took another foot of pasture from either side, which was true, and which had been true for at least 2 years without him mentioning it before. He looked at Clover in the near pen the way a man looks at something he does not have a name for yet, and said only that he had not seen her color on a cow in this county before. Marigold said she was a Guernsey, or close to it, and left it at that. He came back the following week to look at the fence line again. He kept coming through that fall on the same pretext, arriving with a handsaw or a roll of wire he never quite got around to using, and Marigold understood by November that the timberline was a courtesy both of them had agreed to observe, rather than a genuine ongoing task. He asked about Clover more than he asked about anything else, how she was wintering, whether the extension office had written back, what the Manhattan family had said about the bull lease, and Marigold answered plainly because there was no particular reason not to. He never once told her what she ought to do with the heifer. He asked questions the way a man asks who wants to understand a thing correctly before he says anything about it. And when she mentioned the $6 stud fee, he only said that seemed a fair price for what she stood to learn, not whether she should spend it. She noticed, distantly, that this was not nothing. Clover calved on the 22nd of August, 1934. A heifer calf, gold fawn like her dam, with the same pale legs and the same steady dark eyes, delivered without complication in the early morning, with Marigold sitting up through the last 2 hours of labor, the way she had read a first calf heifer sometimes needed watching. She named the calf Buttercup, and she milked Clover for the first time 3 days later, once the colostrum had cleared, and she sent the first full sample to the county extension office for a butterfat test because she wanted a number from someone other than herself before she believed what her own eyes were telling her about the cream line in the milk pail. The test came back at 5 1/10% butterfat, nearly half again what her shorthorns had ever produced, and the extension agent's note attached to the result observed, with some professional restraint, that this was a strong result for an unregistered animal, and that continued testing across the full lactation would establish whether it held. It held. Marigold tested monthly through the fall and into winter, and the figure never dropped below 4.8, and the milk itself, when she let it stand in the flat pans overnight the way her mother always had, threw a cream line so thick and so deeply gold that she found herself standing at the pantry shelf some mornings, simply looking at it before she did anything else with it. She took the first churning of butter to Halloran's general store in November, 6 pounds pressed into the wooden molds her mother had used, and set it on the counter without announcement. Ferris Halloran picked up a pound, turned it over, and looked at the color of it for longer than he usually looked at anything a farm wife brought him. He said he had not seen butter that color out of a Kansas herd since before the war, and he asked what she wanted for it. She had done the arithmetic already, comparing what the extension bulletin had described as the specialty premium against what she knew of standard butter prices running 18 to 20 cents a pound that fall. She asked for 30 cents. He paid it without arguing, which told her more than the number itself did. We're halfway through this story, and we want to know, have you ever tasted the difference between milk from different cattle breeds, or seen that deep gold cream color for yourself? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your reminder. New stories every week. Word moved through Barclay County the way it always did, through the store counter and the church steps and the co-op loading dock. And by December, several of the town's better-off households were asking Halloran directly whether the Ashcraft butter was in yet, and paying the 30 cents without the hesitation that had greeted Marigold's first churning. Halloran himself took to holding back 2 pounds every week before he set the rest out, a habit he admitted to only when Marigold asked why her own count at the register never quite matched what she delivered, and he said plainly that his wife had taken a liking to it that he did not intend to argue with. Hetty Voss, who ran the millinery shop and considered herself an authority on what passed for refinement in a county that mostly could not afford the question, remarked to 2 other women in Marigold's hearing that a widow's daughter running a farm alone was one thing, but running it towards some gold-colored cow instead of a sensible black and white breed suggested a woman more taken with appearances than sense. Marigold thanked her for the observation with the specific courtesy she had learned from her mother. the courtesy that cost nothing and conceded nothing, and went home and recorded the week's butter income in the ledger, which by the second week of December stood higher than the entire cream check the two shorthorns had produced in the whole of the previous year. Daniel came to the fence on a Thursday in January with a piece of information rather than a fence-line pretext, which she noticed because he had stopped bothering with the pretext sometime in November, and neither of them had remarked on it. He said the county agricultural agent had been asking around about her cow, whether she would consider having it evaluated formally, because word had reached him that a hotel in Wichita had begun advertising Guernsey butter specifically on its dining room menu, and was having trouble finding a reliable supplier anywhere in the state. Marigold said she would consider it. Daniel looked at Clover in the pasture, heavy again with a second calf by then, and at Buttercup beside her, and said that if the Wichita account came through, she would need more than 2 milking animals to supply it consistently, which was arithmetic she had already run herself but had not said aloud to anyone. He asked, with the particular carefulness of a man who had decided the fence-line pretext no longer covered what he actually wanted to say, whether she intended to keep both animals or sell the calf once she'd confirmed the bloodline held. Marigold told him plainly that the herd was never going to be a herd she sold out of one animal at a time. The value here was in the milk and the butter, in what a Guernsey herd could produce every season for as long as she kept it, not in what any single cow might fetch at a one-time sale. A breeding program built slowly from Clover and Buttercup, and whatever came after them was worth more across 5 years than any buyer's offer for the pair of them would be worth in one afternoon. Daniel said that was the answer he had expected, and did not ask again. The Wichita hotel account came through in March of 1935, arranged through the county extension agent, who had grown genuinely invested in what he now referred to, not entirely as a joke, as the Ashcraft Guernsey experiment. The hotel's kitchen manager drove out himself to see the operation before committing to anything. A cautious man named Prescott, who walked the barn and watched Marigold's milking routine and asked pointed questions about butterfat consistency and sanitation that she answered from the testing ledger she had kept faithfully since the first sample. He offered a standing weekly contract for butter and sweet cream both, at a rate that made Holleran's 30 cents look like the opening figure it had always been. Marigold did the arithmetic that evening at the kitchen table, what 2 cows could supply against what the contract required, and understood immediately that she needed to expand the herd faster than natural calving alone would manage. She wrote back to the Manhattan breeders and arranged to purchase 2 additional bred Guernsey heifers, drawing against the winter's butter income and a small advance against the Wichita contract that Prescott agreed to extend once he understood what he was securing. Daniel arrived at the kitchen door on the evening the contract papers came. Not the fence line, the door, which she noted was itself a kind of statement neither of them needed to put into words. He had brought the survey figures for the north section of his own family's land, the section that bordered her pasture along the same scrub timber line that had been his first pretext 18 months before, and he set them on the table without explanation until she asked. He said the section would carry additional grazing if the herd grew the way the Wichita contract suggested it would need to, and that he had been thinking, since roughly the week Clover calved, about what use 2 adjoining properties might make of each other that 2 separate properties could not. Marigold looked at the survey figures and then at him, at the hazel-green eyes that had spent a year and a half cataloging a fence line that had needed clearing for exactly as long as it took him to find a reason worth admitting to. She said that was a significant thing to bring to a kitchen table on a Tuesday. He said he had been considering it since long before it was convenient to say so, and that the herd and the contract and the county's slowly reversing opinion of a gold cow nobody had wanted had simply given him the opening he had been waiting for. She asked him to stay for supper. He stayed. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. Leave a comment below. What's the most unlikely investment you've ever seen turn into something real? Your stories are what makes this community what it is. Subscribe if you haven't already. We'll have a new story for you next week. By the following spring, the Ashcraft herd numbered 7 Guernseys, Clover and Buttercup among them. The 2 Manhattan heifers calved and milking, and the Wichita contract had expanded to a second hotel account in the same city on Prescott's recommendation, who had by then taken a personal interest in the operation that went beyond his kitchen supply needs, driving out twice more that spring simply to see how the herd was progressing. Hetty Voss had stopped commenting on gold cows in Marigold's hearing, which Marigold noted without needing anyone to apologize for what had come before. Daniel came to the kitchen door most evenings by then. Not every evening. He had his own 80 acres and his own obligations, but most, and the scrub timberline that had started the whole business of fence line visits had finally been cleared that April by both of them, on a Saturday that took most of the day and ended with supper at the Ashcraft table the way most Saturdays had begun to. Marigold sat some evenings with the testing ledger open in front of her, the butterfat figures climbing in a column beside the older, thinner numbers from the Shorthorn years, and she thought sometimes of the rancher at the fairgrounds trailer who had wanted the gold heifer gone for $4 because she was the wrong color for what he thought a cow should be. She had not been wrong. She had simply been correct about something nobody else standing at that trailer had troubled to notice, and she had been willing to spend the year it took to prove it, feeding correctly and watching carefully through a winter that had asked nothing of her except the same patience the farm had always asked of anyone who meant to keep it.